Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. Just to make sure that you're all in the right place, you should be able to see my screen that says PAS 2060, the journey to carbon neutrality. That's what we're going to be having a look at this afternoon. And as I say, welcome to you all. My name is Richard Walsh and I'm one of NQA's Principal Assessors. My particular area of expertise, if you wish to call it that, is energy and environment, and I'm also a lead carbon verifier, and it's that particular hat I shall be wearing this afternoon. If you've not joined us before, I would imagine most of you probably have, and some of you maybe have listened to other of my webinars. Just a little bit about who we are, who NQA are. That's a little bit of an overview of where we are in the world and the types of things that we certify. And again, just a slide that shows the types of areas that we work in. And a slide that possibly wants a little bit of updated now, but those are still sort of some of our main current clients across the world, and that could probably be updated a little bit. These are just slides that I sort of joke that I'm contractually obliged to show. Anyway, on to where we are going to make a start. That's me, if you've not met me before. So I'm, as I say, NQA's Principal Assessor covering energy and environment, and I've been at NQA for almost 17 years now, having worked prior to that for a UK environmental charity called Groundwork. So I've been working environmentally since the mid-90s anyway, so probably 30 years now. So just a little bit of housekeeping. So actually, I probably just need to update the slide actually because it's not quite correct. We will be speaking for about 45-50 minutes. There will be a chance for questions towards the end. If you have any questions as we go along, please don't type them in the chat box. Please actually type them in the question box that you should see on the screen. What we'll do, we'll either save the questions to the end, or I may choose to answer them as we're going along, if I feel that that's the most relevant point. So apologies for that slight amendment. I probably said that last time and forgot to change it, so I will make a point of amending that. And to save you madly scribbling down everything I'm saying, there will be a recording of the webinar circulated in a couple of days' time, and you will also receive a PDF copy of all of the slides. So you will get everything that we see and you hear this afternoon, and that includes those people who registered for the webinar and haven't attended. So all those who registered will get all of that information. So what is it we're going to be actually looking at this afternoon? So we'll be having a quick look at what is carbon neutrality. I always like to start my webinars assuming that nobody knows anything, start with the lowest common denominator. So we'll have a quick look at carbon neutrality, what it's all about, why it's important, maybe just a quick look at different definitions to make sure that we all have the same understanding. We will be having a look at the PAS 2060 approach, and we shall also be seeing that there are some developments with that particular standard, and we'll be having a look at what's happening in that area as well. We'll look at what the standard requires, basic principles of the standard, and the main stages, and then, as I say, a chance for some questions towards the end, and that just sort of expands a little bit further about the sorts of things that we're going to be looking at this afternoon. So as I say, I'll be speaking for about 45-50 minutes. So it's 2:05 here in the UK. Don't know where you are in the world, but yeah, about 2:05. And I hope by the time we've finished everything, we'll have kept it down to about an hour. So just to have a quick look at some definitions, which we will come back to as we go through the webinar. So carbon neutrality, a state of balance between the carbon dioxide or global warming gases, greenhouse gases, call them what you will. It's not just CO2, as we'll see later, between the carbon emitted into the atmosphere and removed from the atmosphere. So it's a balance. Zero carbon is no carbon emissions being produced. That is almost an impossibility. And then obviously there are one or two organisations now that claim to be carbon negative. And that's a reduction in their carbon footprint to below neutral, so that there is a net effect of removing carbon from the atmosphere rather than adding to it, and that is usually done through an offsetting process. One or two questions we get is what's covered in carbon neutrality. Generally, the Carbon Trust, that's here in the UK, define carbon neutrality having a minimum requirement of covering scopes 1 and 2, with scope 3 encouraged. However, there is an increasing requirement these days now, and net zero does require coverage of scopes 1, 2 and 3. And as I say, we'll have a look at those shortly and see what we mean by those. So the current definition of net zero. So the Science Based Targets Initiative, you may see abbreviated to SBTI, has defined net zero targets for corporations as follows. So it says that to reach a state of net zero emissions for companies or any organisations, it implies 2 conditions. So reducing scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions to 0, or to what the SBTI now define as a residual level that's consistent with reaching net zero emissions at the global or sector level in eligible 1.5 degrees centigrade aligned pathways. Now that's a lot of not waffle, but it's a lot of information there, and let's just try and pick through that a little bit. So what the SBTI have defined is a pathway for organisations to reach to get down to what they consider is the net zero emissions that they can achieve. So not everybody is going to be able to get to 0. So therefore, it may be that in a particular sector, and I'm speaking off the top of my head, I don't know the exact numbers, I don't have them to hand, but it may be that a particular manufacturing sector may have set for them an emissions target of 25%. And that is the net zero target to get to that point. And then once that point has been reached, neutralising any residual emissions, and that is done through offsetting. So it's a journey to get down to the set target, and then when that is achieved, to then be using a bona fide offsetting scheme to neutralise the remaining emissions. There is a slight confusion sometimes about what is the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality. Now I'm slightly jumping ahead because there is a new standard which we'll talk about later, ISO 14068/1 or -1, and that is a standard, as we'll see later, that will replace in a couple of years' time PAS 2060. And this is taken from that particular standard. Carbon neutrality and net zero greenhouse gas emissions are related concepts. And this has been defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and the 2 terms are considered to be equivalent. Both refer to the condition in which anthropogenic, so by that we mean man-made, in which anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by anthropogenic greenhouse gas removals over a specified period. So again, it's that balance. It's a net zero. It's taking out the atmosphere an equivalent amount that is being added. And that's, I think, a very helpful definition. And that's right at the very start of that ISO standard, which we'll come on to in a short while. So obviously, this may be old news. It probably is old news to everybody, but again, to solve the problem of man-made anthropogenic emissions and their effects on climate change, we have to take account of what we're doing, what we're emitting, and making continued efforts to reduce them. We're not going to get to zero. No matter how hard we try, we will never get to absolute zero emissions. And carbon neutrality allows the closing of this gap by purchasing carbon offsets. So, as we see there, the Earth's 4.5 billion years old, and many changes over that time. And as an example, 18,000 years ago, most of Britain was covered in ice and glaciers, and we're in the middle of an ice age. And up to the last sort of 150, 200 years, up to the Industrial Revolution, changes in climate had been entirely natural. And there still is an element of natural climate change. The climate is not a static thing, not a static being. There are still natural changes in the climate. However, the current changes are deemed to be a result of increasing human population and associated activities. And I meet a lot of people in this job. I meet a lot of skeptics. I also meet a lot of people who are ambivalent, and also a lot of people who I call them evangelistic in terms of their views on climate change. And I can sort of pigeonhole them into three areas, and I'm not going to go any further than saying what these three positions are, and I certainly ain't going to give you a clue on my position. However, obviously the deniers would say that global warming is not occurring, and so therefore neither is climate change. That global warming and climate change are occurring, but these are totally natural cyclic events or cyclic events, completely unrelated to human activity. And thirdly, that global warming is occurring, and I do use the word mainly, as a result of human activity, and so climate change is also a direct result of that human activity. And I put the word mainly in there because obviously there is still some natural cycles in terms of the climate, but the changes that we are seeing at the moment are mainly as a result of human activity. And I think that is a fairly agreed position across the globe. And scientists attribute the current warming to the use of fossil fuels. We're releasing into the atmosphere stores of carbon that were sequestered, and that's a term we come across a lot, sequestering or buried millions of years ago. We burnt coal, we burnt trees, we burnt coal rather, that was trees that millions and millions of years ago went into the ground, crushed and returned into coal, and we're now burning that coal and releasing that. That goes the same for oil, which is as a result of organisms that were in the sea, and again, carbon that was locked up, stored for millions and millions of years, and is now being released. So the adding of this old carbon to the world's current stock of carbon is what's tipping the balance. So what are the main culprits? Obviously, carbon dioxide is the big one, and there are various figures, but they all agree that it's somewhere in the region of 2/3. So I think the pie chart I show is 65%. I was having a look this morning. I saw another pie chart now that said it was 66%, but I don't think we need to worry too much about the minute details. It's about 2/3. So 2/3 of the global warming gases, greenhouse gases, are carbon dioxide, and that's carbon dioxide coming from fossil fuels, burning of fossil fuels, cars, industrial processes. Another 11% or so, so that's taking that 65% up to 3/4, if not a little bit more, is other carbon dioxide coming from land use, from agriculture, from forestry, etc., etc. Methane is a big one, and methane is relative to carbon dioxide is 30 times approximately 30 times as potent as a greenhouse gas. Again, I've seen some varying figures. I've seen figures that a bit higher than that, and I've seen some that say, oh, it's only 27%. So that's a little bit of an average, but it's about 30 times as damaging. So 1 kilogram of methane would have the same effect as 30 kilograms of carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide, beloved by young people at the moment. However, it is a byproduct of fertilizer production and use, and as you can see, they're 270 times as potent. We then come on to the F gases. There we see mostly in air conditioning systems, and they've replaced ozone depleting substances, but they also have quite a significant global warming potential, somewhere between 800 and 10,000 times. And by far the worst thing that we ever see is SF6, sulfur hexafluoride, which you will find in high voltage applications. And should that ever leak, a kilogram of sulfur hexafluoride has the same global warming potential of nearly 23 tons of carbon dioxide. So that's just a little bit of background as to where these gases are coming from. And again, you can see the second pie chart shows you the sectors that are producing most of those gases. So here in the UK, what are we doing about it? One of the things that the government have been doing, and not just the current government, but governments since the late 80s into the early 90s, we have been setting carbon budgets. The 6th carbon budget has been set, and you can see there the different carbon budgets that have been set, CB1 through to CB6, carbon budget 1 through to carbon budget 6. And each of those budgets sets a target, and generally we are ahead of the target, as you can see. So the current period that we're in is sort of the carbon budget taking us through to 2025, carbon budget 4. Because we're almost there now, the one that I'm showing is carbon budget 5, which is looking for a 68% reduction in UK carbon emissions from the 1990 baseline. And that's what the if you like, the actual pathway is showing, with this sort of net zero position of being down to 78% reduction by 2035. Obviously the graph shows it going, the recommended net zero shows it going down to zero. That will never happen. Okay, again, this was a document that was put together a couple of years ago. I'm sure that this will change. It is already changing a little bit, but to try and put some of those plans into actions, this was a 10-point plan produced by the current government a couple of years ago now. Some of it will happen, some of it's up in the air, some of it will change, and obviously we're in quite a fluid position this year in the UK in terms of governments. So be prepared to see some of this change. I'm not going to read them out, but the 10-point plan covered, as you can see, things like wind, hydrogen, nuclear, use of EVs, electric vehicles, right the way down to carbon capture, nature, using restoring the natural environment, and particularly important, innovation and finance. So again, you can see that I'm sure there will be updates on some of that, but generally those are the areas. Even an incoming government will still be supporting most of those areas. There may be some tweaks to some of the numbers. So where are we today then? We are at what we call an important inflection point. People are coming together, governments, industry, civil society. Yeah, I accept, Gail, solar and tidal power, that's sort of all in there. Yeah, there's lots and lots of other things. It's not an exhaustive list, and I'm not really an expert in government plans, but yes, there's those are the main 10-point headings. But yeah, solar, tidal power are all incredibly important and will be somewhere within those 10 points. Yeah, there is a growing global consensus that we have to have a zero or a net zero carbon future. And to achieve the goals that were set in Paris, we must halve our global emissions over the next decade, and we have to move faster. And a comment that was made a year or two ago now by Caroline Fairbairn, who was a previous director of the Confederation of British Industry, Immediate and decisive action is needed to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change and create opportunities in low carbon technologies. And I think that that is the way forward. At the end of the day, we live in the 21st century. We have an expectation to have access to all of the trappings of modern life. However, we can do it in a sustainable way, and using low carbon technologies. We can use, as Gail prompted me to say, things like solar is increasing. You drive around now, you're seeing solar panels. I won't get into too many of the arguments about where the solar panels come from and how they're made, etc., etc. However, they are becoming much more prevalent, that type of technology, but also looking at different technologies to allow us to use energy, different energy sources, low carbon energy sources in a much more acceptable way. So why do we need standards? Why do we need standards to actually demonstrate what it is we're doing? Sadly, one of the phrases that we still see used quite a bit is a term called greenwashing. And greenwashing is an attempt to capitalize on the growing demand for environmentally sound products. And greenwashing can convey a false impression that a company or an organization or its products are environmentally sound. And genuinely green products generally are genuinely sustainable businesses back up their claims, back up their achievements with facts, with verifiable details. So how do we go about doing this? And that brings us on to a raft of standards, but the one we're particularly going to look at this afternoon is PAS 2060, which is a specification for the demonstration of carbon neutrality. And what it does, it specifies requirements that any entity, and that's a phrase that the standard uses, any organization, any business, any group who wish to demonstrate carbon neutrality through the quantification, the reduction and offsetting of greenhouse gas emissions from what again is called a uniquely identified subject. So in other words, it's a little bit like a management system. You define a boundary and you say, this is the boundary that we're going to claim carbon neutrality for. And then PAS 2060 explains how that is documented and verified. It's an old standard. It's sort of taken off a lot in the last 3 or 4 years. Certainly for us at NQA, it's sort of gone through the roof in terms of people requesting this. It's carbon neutrality particularly is one of our fastest growing areas of business. So it's been around since 2010 in its initial form. It was reissued 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago to the day, in April 2014, and it is to be replaced. It's been being replaced by a new ISO standard, ISO 14068-1. So I alluded to that earlier on in the presentation, which was actually published on the 30th of November 2023. So that standard is about 3 or 4 months old now, and it's sort of followed the route of other standards. So ISO 14001 as an example started out as a British standard. If you cast your mind back to the early 90s, it was British Standard 7750, and that's how I got involved in all of this stuff 30 odd years ago. That British standard eventually was taken up by ISO and was produced and published as ISO 14001. PAS 2060 has now been taken up by ISO, and the standard has now been published, ISO 14068, which means that PAS 2060 is going to be formally withdrawn 2 years after the published date of 14068. So 30th of November 2025, PAS 2060 will be formally withdrawn, and we're starting to now look at offering verification to 14068, and probably from 12 months or thereabouts, we will probably stop certifying or verifying people to PAS 2060. So that's where we're going in the future. But for now, we're going to talk about PAS 2060, and there are some fairly small, subtle differences between the two standards. They are generally achieving the same thing. So don't worry if you're thinking that this might be something that's interesting. Any work that you do, people who've already got PAS 2060, it will be a fairly smooth transition. Why might we do it? Again, it's to demonstrate that we are doing things ethically, we are doing things in a provable, demonstrable way. And it does demonstrate that as an organisation, we have integrity in our environmental claims. Provides a clear and credible message that will allow customers to trust the message that we're giving out. It allows businesses, organisations to meet increasing demand for environmentally friendly, I'm not so keen on that phrase these days, but environmentally sound products and services. It helps engage and motivate staff and other people involved within the organisation to reduce costs, because again, working environmentally, working sustainably, working in a reducing carbon manner is a sound way of working. And ultimately, it allows organisations to differentiate themselves from the competition and will allow them to increase their revenue and market share. So how does PAS 2060 as a standard work? I'm just conscious, other than Gail pointing out something, I'm conscious that nobody's asked a question yet, which in a way is good. Hope you haven't all nodded off. I don't think you have. So again, just a reminder that you can type questions in if you wish to as we go along. Other than that, we'll have a little bit of a section at the end where we'll cover any questions. So PAS 2060 has 4 basic principles. Oh, there we go. Right, yes, I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that question at Koos. I will get back to that. So the standard sets measurements and reduction targets for any organisation and through the examination of documents and plans. So the 4 standards: measure, reduce, offset, document and validate. So what can be certified, what can be verified? Actually, technically, it's verification rather than certification. But that's a sort of a bit of a nuance within the certification system. People still talk about being certified to PAS 2060, and I don't have an issue with that. So the entity, as I said earlier, that's a little bit like the scope of a management system. So what is it that is being claimed as carbon neutral? The entity needs to uniquely identify itself so that there's no confusion, identify the subject of the declaration of carbon neutrality, establish all of the characteristics of that subject. What's its purpose? What's its objectives? How does it function? And then take into account all activities, everything that happens in order to fulfill, achieve, or deliver the purpose of the entity. So in other words, setting the boundaries is basically what that little slide's all about. And interestingly, it can cover any of those particular entities. So if we just look at the left-hand column at the moment, public sector, communities, organisations, companies, parts of, doesn't have to be a whole company, just in the same way that with, say, ISO 14001, you don't have to certify the entire organisation. You can certify or verify, in this case, a part of a business, and we do have that. Clubs, social groups, families, or even individuals. I've never known any of the bottom 3 do that, but the standard does permit any of those to declare themselves as carbon neutral. And again, covers activities, products, services, buildings, projects, major developments, events, developments. All of the things on there can be set as entities within PAS 2060. So the starting point of, as with anything, as with any journey, if you're setting out on a journey, the first thing you need to know is, where are we currently? Even your sat nav will calculate how to get somewhere based on where you currently are. So the starting point for this is to calculate the actual carbon footprint for the entity seeking the declaration. And there's a number of methodologies that can be used. Most of the people that we come across are using ISO 14064/1. and that is an accepted method for calculating your own carbon footprint. But as you can see, there are other ways forward. So again, here in the UK, under SECR, which is sort of carbon reporting more on a financial basis, but there are again set ways of doing that here in the UK, and the government produce annual tables that convert all of the different fuels, all of the different activities, all of the different raw materials, resources through into kilograms of carbon per unit of use. But there's lots and lots of ways of doing that, all of which are considered acceptable. So the carbon footprint measurement itself must include a minimum of the 95% of the total emissions within the organisation, and can exclude, and this is what PAS 2060 states, can exclude emissions that constitute less than 1% of the total. However, the sum of those little 1% or less than 1% cannot add up to more than 5%. So if you've got something that's 0.2%, technically that can be excluded. However, the point I make out to all the clients that I work with is that in order to show that it's less than 1%, you have to calculate it, or you have to have calculated it. And if you've gone to the trouble of calculating it, why wouldn't you include it? Because you have to demonstrate. You can't just make an assumption that it's less than 1%. So again, apologies if this is old news, but the three scopes that we're looking at scope 1, direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. So if you have a gas boiler, you're burning gas on site, the carbon dioxide associated with that fuel use is a scope 1 emission. If you have a company vehicle and are driving around and using diesel or petrol or even electricity these days, although that's slightly different there, so maybe that was a bad example. But if you're burning gas, using diesel, using petrol, driving around, direct emissions, they are scope 1 emissions. The other area that people sometimes miss are what we class as fugitive emissions. So think back to the different types of greenhouse gases, and I talked about air conditioning particularly. If as part of your servicing of your air conditioning you identify there's been a leak of the gas, that fugitive emission is also a scope 1 emission. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, steam, heating and cooling. For most people, probably for 99% of people, it's the electricity that's bought. So you put a plug in the wall, you're using electricity, that electricity has been generated in a power station, in a wind turbine, somewhere upstream. We have to account for that. And then scope 3, which is the hardest one to quantify, but scope 3 are all the other indirect emissions that occur in an organization's value chain. So that's upstream and downstream. So things like waste treatment, purchasing of goods, business travel, employee commuting. There's a whole range, far too many to go into.
I think I'm back on the audio. Can people hear me now? I think we're back. Can somebody just let me know that we're back? For some reason, I just got a message popped up to say that the sound had done. I'm working from home. So are we back? Yes, you can hear me now. Thank you. I'm back. Excellent. Excellent. Oh, you don't all have to tell me. Thank you. Thank you. All good. Right, we'll keep going then. So the question that was asked, and I've got to scroll back through all the people saying, hello, yes, you're back. So the question was, under PAS 2060, does the organisation set its own goal or targeted carbon neutrality? And really, it's for you to set your own target. So you set the target, you decide what that target's going to be. If I'm honest, the thing that we look for is for organisations to follow the Science-Based Targets Initiative trajectory for their particular sector. That's where we tend to be looking, and trying to get to the point that the Science-Based Targets Initiative will have you achieve. Where I think carbon neutrality differs slightly from the SBTI initiative, they would look for a year-on-year reduction in carbon, but not require any offsetting as part of the journey. PAS 2060 requires, for the carbon neutrality, requires the offsetting to be done as you are on the journey. So therefore, what we are looking for is a reduction, a target that you set. However, all the standard requires is a year-on-year reduction in carbon. Now, I am just going to try changing my microphone back to where it was and see if it stays.
Okay, so I think we're back. Yes, just gone back to a different microphone, which should sound a little bit better. So the timescale for achieving carbon neutrality is set by yourselves. There needs to be specific targets, and also the carbon reduction plan also has to detail how those reductions are going to be achieved. What is it you're actually going to do on site? Is it going to be upgrading lighting? Is it going to be a lower carbon heating system? Is it going to be different manufacturing methods? However, the plan, as I've said, has to be updated annually. We're looking for the term continual improvement. However, it is not about penalising success. And companies, organisations that are expanding are likely to see their overall carbon footprint increase. So the declared reduction can be absolute or carbon intensity. So by carbon intensity, we mean tons of carbon per, say, £1,000 of turnover, or tons of carbon per unit of production. If you're producing widgets, you might say, how many tons of carbon does it take to produce 1,000 widgets? Obviously, doubling the amount of widgets under normal circumstances would double the amount of carbon. But so long as that doubling of production doesn't double the amount of carbon, then that's still an improvement in carbon intensity. So that's what we're looking for. So under reduction, we're looking for year-on-year reductions in carbon. Now, this, as I said earlier, this is where things get a little bit, in some areas I've worked with, a little bit controversial, because carbon offsetting hasn't always had the best press over the years. And a number of organisations I work with are not overly keen on using carbon offsetting. The standard does permit it, the standard does require it, but also does go to set some qualitative requirements for the offsets that are being used. So PAS 2060 requires that the total amount of carbon emissions at the end of a reduction period to be offset by high quality certified carbon credits, which meet the following criteria. And this is taken from the standard. So one of the PAS 2060 approved schemes, for example, the Clean Development Mechanism, joint implementation, gold standard or voluntary carbon standard, it requires that they have to be genuinely additional, that the reductions wouldn't have happened anyway. And the offsets have to have been verified by an independent third party to ensure that emission reductions are permanent avoid leakage. And just as a little bit of a definition, leakage is about, and we see this all the time. So an organization may say, we're going to buy everything from China now. We're not going to make things ourselves anymore. We're going to buy them from somewhere else in the world, probably China. So therefore, we're not producing carbon anymore. We're just buying in a product. That's leakage. Leakage is really all about sending your emissions, if you like, somewhere else in the world. So that's what we mean by, if you see that term, leakage. And are not double counted, obviously. You can only, those offsets can only be sold once, and they have to be retired. That's the phrase that's used. They're retired to what's called a credible registry, and as part of PAS 2060, we then check that there is what's called a retirement certificate. Again, so there's some lists there of the types of schemes that are considered approved, if you like, as part of PAS 2060. One of the questions I get asked sometimes is, what sort of quantities are we going to end up having to offset? And again, I'm not going to read this. You're quite capable of having a look at this. These are just some figures I plucked out from various sources across the internet. They are fairly generalized, so I'm not prepared to enter into a discussion about the validity of them. They're just to give you a bit of an idea about the different levels of carbon that are being produced by organizations, by people across the globe, talking about everything from flights, building construction, and individual carbon emissions. So the final stage of the process then is to document, verify, and then declare carbon neutrality. And this requires a statement that the required standards have been met and supported by what's called a qualifying explanatory statement. And the standard requires public disclosure of all documentation supporting the carbon neutrality statement. And in practice, this includes proof of the emissions reductions, withdrawn offsetting credits, so a copy of the certificate that shows that the offsets have been withdrawn, a copy of the carbon footprint report, the carbon management plan, all contained, all wrapped up in a qualifying explanatory statement. And the requirement to provide all of this information and have it signed off by a senior member of the organisation's management is fundamental to the final validation of carbon neutrality status. Now, one of the other questions I got that said, will 14,068 also make provision for three types of verification: self, other party, or third party? And my understanding is yes, it does. Just interestingly, as a result of 14068, there is now a UCAS accreditation, just as there is for management standards. And I'm pleased to say that NQA, along with a number of other bodies, are now UCAS accredited in order to carry out this type of activity, which of course, again, adds some degree of validation to the work that's being carried out. But yeah, so the three types, which I'm going to come on to, are self-validation. So in other words, an organisation just makes a declaration themselves. The one that I always joke about for people who are in the UK and have may have seen the adverts, if you were to type in Marks and Spencer's carbon neutrality and look for their qualifying explanatory statement, so you type in Marks and Spencer's qualifying explanatory statement, you will find it, and you will find that it is a self-validation. And I always joke that it's not just carbon neutrality, it's Marks and Spencer's carbon neutrality. On the basis that that's who we are, why wouldn't you believe us? And people might. We would say independent third-party validation, now with UCAS accreditation, gives you the if you like, the gold standard. But we are, as I say, a UCAS accredited energy and environmental management certification body as well. So we are able to provide this fully independent validation. So how does our process work? If you came to NQA and said we'd like to be to have our carbon neutrality verified, it's similar to the management system certification process. Stage one, pre-verification. So that determines the client's readiness for a full verification. And it's used by us to understand what you're all about, the activities, the processes which are driving greenhouse gas emissions, and enable the development of a risk-based plan for stage two being the actual verification. And it's a full review of the greenhouse gas inventory in accordance with 14064, and will include an assessment of your methods for data capture, analysis, conversion, and reporting. And I always say it's very, very similar to having the accountants in looking at your finances, looking through your books. The difference being, instead of pounds and pennies, we are looking at tons and kilograms of carbon. Very, very similar. Usually involves being presented with a spreadsheet, and we're working back through that spreadsheet, making sure that the calculations are correct, making sure that the conversions are correct, and making sure then that we've got evidence that we can then look at to see that those figures are genuine. The final stage is a post-verification, which is a secondary review of the workings from everybody, from the client and from the verifier, to provide further assurance and integrity. And as it says there, it doesn't require the client to be involved, and it's carried out fully remotely. So we talked about 14068 as being the new kid on the block, and that certainly is. It is available now for people to use. And again, it's a specification relating to greenhouse gas management and related activities. And it is more or less aligned between the current standard, PAS 2060, and 14068. It was published in November 23, and it establishes a hierarchy for carbon neutrality. This is the main difference. So greenhouse gas emission reductions and greenhouse gas removal enhancements take priority over offsetting. One of the perceived weaknesses with PAS 2060 is you can rely quite heavily on offsetting, and as I said earlier, offsetting doesn't always have the best press, mainly through historic abusers of the process. So it does set a priority. So obviously the first thing to look at are the actual greenhouse gas emissions, direct and indirect, within scopes 1 and 2, but also scope 3 within the value chain. And those reductions take priority over offsetting. And it includes requirements for carbon neutrality commitments and making the neutrality claims. It has a number of core principles which are similar to PAS 2060, and not identical, but generally are achieving the same thing. Transparency is the #1 requirement. Public disclosure to enable stakeholders to make informed decisions. The term conservativeness, nothing to do with politics here. It's about the assumptions, the values and procedures. So in other words, it's looking for overestimation and not underestimation. So if there is any doubt in any of the areas of data collection, and in some cases there may have to be an estimation that's made, we look for that estimation to be conservative. So in other words, slightly higher rather than being slightly lower. And it's a principle within the standard that conservativeness has to be taken into account where estimations are made. It has this hierarchy approach of reductions, removals within the boundary in the value chain, and then offsetting. It's a standard that will help support transition. It's about enabling sustainable development and trying to move organizations away from the business as usual or business as usual approach. And it does include this thing called urgency. And it's looking for immediate and then ongoing action. It is wrapped around using this science-based approach. So having said that you can set your own targets, your own reduction targets, that's fine. But it does have an expectation that those targets are going to be nearer the science-based approach than almost a flat line. So it does look for following the science. And whether the science is going to change, I don't know. But at the moment, the Science Based Targets Initiative is still working on this trajectory based on a 1.5 degree increase in temperature. And ultimately, accountability. So the accountability rests with the entity which controls the subject of any claim. So again, that's fairly standard. Right, I'm going to come on to some questions shortly because there's a few more questions come in. We're not far from the end of the presentation bit, and that is and I'm going to be honest, I did pinch this from another website, but it was quite nicely showed it and fitted onto a page. That's why it looks slightly blurred, but I did pinch this from another website. It's the same sections that are in the standard, but it's, as you can see there, it sort of follows the almost like a cyclical approach. So you make the commitment to carbon neutrality, select the subject and the boundaries of the declaration, quantify emissions and the removals, develop an implementation carbon neutrality plan, implement emissions reductions and increase the removals of carbon from the chain, offset the remainder, meet the reporting requirements, and then actually make the claim. And actually, you could argue that between 8 and 3 it would be another little arrow, if you like, and you're then into that circle. Every year, you're going round and round that circle in terms of every year developing, amending the plan, implementing further emissions, further offsetting, reporting, making the claim, and then carrying on. It's an annual process. Few tips just towards the end before we come on to the questions. You would expect me to say this, but we would always recommend that you seek certification from an accredited external body, because it will bolster your credibility. We're not all Marks and Spencers. So it does give that additional credibility, and we're finding, as I said earlier, a huge increase in businesses, organisations wanting that seal of approval from ourselves, that actually that they're doing this properly, they're committed to doing it, and here is a third party, a credible third party, who are telling us, they're telling everybody that what we're actually saying is true. Make the most of technology. Use dashboards, database solutions to find out where the carbon is in your supply chain, and use solutions, technological solutions where possible to mitigate it. There's all sorts of things coming along, developments, different ways, heat pumps, all sorts of different things that people can now use to start to reduce carbon. Innovation is key to making this this work. And ultimately, the commitment has to come from the top. Large-scale change is only possible, only successful in any organisation if there is buy-in and visible support from the people at the top. It's a shared responsibility. Once each employee in each department within an organisation see their own carbon footprint, you're empowering people and encouraging people to find ways to reduce it. Collaborate with other organisations. Ask your suppliers and partners how they can help you reduce your carbon footprint. And I think, to me, this is one of the exciting parts of it, that businesses working with their suppliers and also getting pressure from their customers. So this supply chain customer pressure is what's driving a lot of this. And again, whilst you are able to set your own targets, set science-based targets, make sure you're playing your fair part in cutting carbon to reach the global goal of attaining that net zero emission. Okay, right, so that's the end of me speaking. We've about 5 or 10 minutes left. That's plenty of time. If you want any additional help, any additional training, we do now have on our NQA site, we do have what's called a sustainability microsite, which will give you much more information. You can speak to people in the office. You can also speak to me. I'll give you my contact details before I go. These are just the slides I'm expected to show towards the end again, just to show that there is further support from NQA. Right, questions. Right. First question from Kevin, and if I'm honest, I don't know the answer. Are offsetting credits tax deductible within the UK? I would argue when we say tax deductible, you're spending money, and I think they are a legitimate business expense. So on that stance, I would say yes. Whether there is any additional credit for that, I'm not so sure. Can families use any of the offsetting methods listed in it? Of course they can. Absolutely. There's a whole range of offsetting. A lot of people use, there's quite a good United Nations offsetting scheme that will give you all sorts of different schemes across the world. Depends whether you're interested in geographic issues, whether you're interested in forestry, whether it's generation of power, whether it's providing alternative methods of cooking, using lower carbon cooking methods in Central and Southern Africa. There's all sorts of different schemes that families can use as well. Scopes, how are they decided? Well, are we talking, Kevin, are we talking about the scope of the system, or are we talking about the three scopes 1, 2, and 3? Because scopes 1, 2, and 3 are set. It doesn't really matter what sector you're in, what business you're in, or even if you're a family. You know, I'm sat here in my house. I have scope 1 emissions, I have scope 2 emissions, I have scope 3 emissions. I have a gas boiler at the moment. If that's running, that's a scope 1 emission. Everything I'm doing at the moment is coming from electricity with a plug in the wall. That's a scope 2 emission. So thank you, Kevin, scope 1, 2, and 3. So it's not, when we say how are they decided, those scopes are set and have been set for years. So scope 1, just to reiterate, scope 1 is something that you do and the emissions are directly controlled by you. So if my boiler's on, I'm burning gas. There's an exhaust coming out the boiler that's putting gas into the atmosphere, and then within that gas is carbon dioxide. That is a scope 1 emission. I am doing that on my site. If I jump in a company car, I do have a company car. If I jump in a company car that's burning diesel or petrol, as I drive on company business, there's gas coming out the exhaust. That is a scope 1 emission, an emission that I am directly causing. A scope 2 emission is an emission associated with, for 99% of people, the use of electricity. Electricity is generated somewhere else. It's not generated on site. It's generated in a power station, it's generated on a wind turbine, or it's wherever it's coming from. There are emissions associated with that. There is a conversion factor for electricity in the grid. That is where scope 2 comes from, and scope 3 are all the other things associated with the things we buy, the things we sell, people that might use our product, things like that. Okay, excuse me, COOS. Is the cycle of verification for PAS also annual? It is. This is an area where the two standards are the same. It's an annual process. So we have clients now that we've been working with. In fact, I'm just in the middle of working with a client for the 3rd year. So every year, that, if you remember that NQA process of a pre-verification, verification, post-verification, that is an annual cycle. So the what we call the opinion statement, which is what you actually get, which confirms that you are carbon neutral, is valid for a period of 12 months. And after 12 months, we go through the process again. Right, John, let's just see if I can find the question again. To establish scope 3 emissions in relation to my employee travel, my employees travel using different means dependent on the weather. Some days they may walk, and when it rains, they use the bus. How and what do I include? So this is where we come in with some degree of estimation. So for employee travel, you see, I'm not sure that when you mean travel, are we talking about employee commuting or traveling through business? Because again, there are different issues here. Employee commuting, so people jumping in the car, jumping on the bus, jumping on the train to come into work in the office and then to go home again. That is a scope 3 emission, and we would normally ask them to fill out some type of survey to say how many days a week are they in the office, how far is the journey, and what is roughly the method of travel, the different methods, and that's where we talk about being conservative in terms of the estimation. If if you're talking about business travel, then there are conversion. So if a company car, that's fairly standard. You know how many miles you've driven to get to a client, to get to an appointment. Likewise for use of the bus, the train, there are conversion factors. So how and what do I include? That's where we would also provide some help and some support. So as part of a pre-verification, we would talk to you about how that may be gathered. But in terms of that type of travel, there is a degree of estimating, because you can't be 100% certain. And we're not going down to the fact that somebody walked in today but then caught the bus home because it was raining. We're just looking for a generic, I worked in the office 200 days, and after those 200 days, I came on the bus for 2/3 of them. And so long as that 2/3 is a slightly overestimation, that's fine. I've run out of questions. Most people are still on the call, so I've run out of questions. That means that you're either really happy, I've answered every question, or I've bored the lot of you to death. I hope I haven't done that. So I'll just waffle for another minute or two to give everybody a chance to just type if there's any more questions. Whilst you're doing that, my contact details, and I am happy for you to email me directly. So my email address is richard.walsh, that's W-A-L-S-H, richard.walsh @nqa.com. Just to reiterate, you will all get copies of the slides within the next couple of days. Because it's a Thursday, it might be early next week. We normally say within 3 or 4 working days. You will get a recording of the presentation with that gap in the middle when for some reason the sound went off, unfortunately. But you will also get copies of all of these slides. As I say, most of the stuff coming through now are just thanks and much appreciated, etc., etc. Thank you, I appreciate that. If you have any more questions, you hang up and you think, oh, I wished I'd asked him this, bob us an email. I'll quite happily chat to you in any way, shape I can. So thank you for your time. Thank you for spending some time with me this afternoon. Hope you have a good rest of the day. It's only one day to the weekend. There are other webinars coming up. I do a number of others on energy, on environment, and there's an interesting one I'm doing in a few weeks on another standard that's taking off, which is ISO 26000, which is a standard all about social responsibility. So therefore, yeah, just keep an eye on those. There is another question. Coos, especially in the agriculture business, if a product is certified, can the site... Right, it's a strange one, is that, because we're not really certifying a bottle of wine. You're certifying the methodology by which the wine was produced, but we're not actually certifying a bottle of wine. A product certification is a slightly different process, still very similar, but once you've produced the bottle of wine is there. It's an interesting one because one of our clients for PAS 2060 is Virgin Wine, and they have included within their certification some accounting of the downstream use. So the fact that if you've bought a bottle of white wine through them, you might want to stick it in the fridge at some point. So that it's a case-by-case basis, Coos. It's always got to be an annual process. But it's how that something like a bottle of wine that might sit on the shelf, or it might sit in wherever. It might be in a wine cellar for 10 years if it's a decent bottle of wine. That's all taken into account, and those sort of specific questions we would handle on a case-by-case basis. But yes, it's not prohibitive. And as I say, in terms of wine, I just pick on that because that's the case you gave. We do have very large clients who we've certified as carbon neutral, taking into account shelf life of wines and things like that. Right, I'm going to draw a line under that. I've gone 5 minutes over, but that's I'm sure not a problem. Thanks again, and as I say, any further questions, give us a shout on that email address, richard.walsh@nqa.com. Thanks a lot. Have a good rest of the day and a good weekend, which is only another day away. All the best. See you all again.